Well, my earliest recollections of being at school, I was at boarding school from the age of 7 because of family circumstances. And so I went to school in prep school in Staffordshire, and then I went to Wrekin College in Shropshire. And when I was at Wrekin College and reached the age of 18, it was wartime. It was 1943. And they sent round recruiting officers. There was a recruiting officer from the Navy and one from the Air Force, talking to all of us who were cannon fodder, ready to go. We hadn't any choice except to get deferment, which I didn't fancy. So this fellow came from the Indian Army, and it all sounded very glamorous. First of all, the Indian, you thought of Kipling and stuff like that. And then, of course, the war in Europe, there was nothing happening in Europe in the war. The war in North Africa had just finished, and the only place there was anything doing was in the Far East. So I thought the Indian Army sounded good. And I volunteered for the Indian Army. I was interviewed and accepted, and within a couple of months of leaving school, at the end of July about, I was on a ship going to India as an officer cadet. And I was trained in Bangalore in southern India, and it wasn't a long training in those days because, of course, it was wartime. But one of the main things we had to learn there was the language of Urdu. We had to be able to speak Urdu, the Indian language. And then came time for commissioning in early 1944. And they asked what regiment you'd want. Well, I didn't know what regiment I wanted. But I only knew, I heard of the Gurkhas, and I knew they were great people, and so I put down 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Gurkhas. And I got the 1st Gurkhas. So there we were. So I joined the regiment, and the first thing they said was, well, you can now forget about the Urdu, and you can start learning Gurkhali. And this was very necessary. You had to be able to speak the language, because most of the men couldn't speak the language either. And you had to have, obviously, communication between the officers and the men that you were talking to, even as a nice little white boy, 2nd lieutenant, you know? So, because Nepal is such a mountainous country that they have, each little valley has its own dialect. So the recruits didn't necessarily, and the young soldiers, didn't necessarily speak the language. We had to learn that language too. Well now, when you're young, languages come fairly easy to most people, not to everybody, but to most people. You can learn languages when you're young. And I was able to learn those languages to a fair amount of proficiency. And so I spent 4 very happy years with the Gurkhas, who were great men, wonderful men. Well, they were also the most fun of all people. They were childishly funny. I mean, they were viciously soldiers. I remember so well that one of my friends had a patrol going out, and he said, if you can manage to sneak me a Japanese watch, I'd like that. So the fellow brought him back a Japanese watch. It was still attached to the arm on which the watch was strapped. Now, there's the old joke, of course, that the Gurkha meets the Japanese, and the Japanese takes a swipe with his sword and goes like this. And the Gurkha ducks, because he's a short fella, and he says, "Ha, you missed." So the Gurkha now goes whoosh with his kukri. And the Japanese fella says, "Ha, you missed." And he says, shake your head. In the regimental headquarters, we used to go once a month, the British fellas, to the Gurkha officers' mess, and once a month they came to ours. And they always had, you sat at a long trestle table, and a Gurkha officer here and a Gurkha officer there, and you'd practice your language with them and have some enjoyment and fun while you were drinking a colorless liquid called rakshi. And it was a distillation of rice. And this thing tasted horrible, but you had to get used to it, you had to drink it. And they had one ambition on these occasions, to get a Gurkha, a British officer, drunk. And so what would happen was the fellow on this side would engage you in conversation, and the fellow on this side would top up your drink with rakshi. You drank it with soda. So we learned that when you take a drink, you top up the bottle with soda, so they can't put more rakshi in it. So then they put more rakshi in the soda bottle, so you're getting yourself worse. And on these occasions, they always had a couple of soldiers outside with a stretcher to carry off any British officer who got drunk and put him to bed. And it happened to one of my colleagues. It could have happened to me, but it happened to be him. That he got plastered, and they carried him off. But instead of taking him to bed, they dropped him in the middle of the parade ground. And he woke up in the morning with the sun coming up and the soldiers gathering for the first parade, and there he was, didn't know where on earth he was. So, of course, he got a good talking off from the commanding officer. Told him, shouldn't you ever do that. But don't let them take advantage of you again. You've learned a lesson, you see. So I had 4 very happy years with the Gurkhas. And even after the war, spent some time in Waziristan, which has recently come into the news because that's where Osama bin Laden's supposed to be hiding. Well, I can tell you there are plenty of caves up there. It's a very rugged country, and the Afghanistan people and the Waziris are related, and they're really nasty, tough. Well, they're tough people. They don't like anybody except their own tribe, and they will shoot you to prove it. And I think they're going to have a very tough time controlling that. The British never dared to send troops into the tribal territories, and neither did Pakistan after it became a separate thing from India. And it's a very difficult part of the world, mountainous, rugged, and nasty. After we got out at the end of the war, I had the great fortune to go to hotel school in Switzerland at the expense of His Majesty, because they had a scheme there which was which ex-servicemen could apply for. And so I went to hotel school. The basis of this was that that's what I thought I would like to do in my life, hotel business and tourism. And all of us thought that, oh, well, after this, we're just going to wander the world, footloose and fancy-free, and take jobs in the hotel industry. I mean, that was easy, you know. Everybody wanted people to work in it. There weren't that many experts then. So we trained for a couple of years, and by the greatest, of course, all of the tuition was in French, and all the exams were in French. So you had to forget the Urdu and the Gurkhali and start to figure in French. It was difficult at first to got them all mixed up. I happened to meet a fella who was a real nasty fella in every respect. A fella called Nick Hilton. And Nick Hilton was the son of Conrad Hilton of Hilton Hotels. Came to the hotel school for about 6 months just so he could say he'd been there. And he was most objectionable. But I happened to find out that he liked the game of cribbage. And my grandfather, one of my grandfathers, Grandfather Cowley, had taught me to play cribbage because, when I was about 10 or 11, because he wanted someone to play cribbage with. And that's how I learned to play cribbage. But Nick liked to play cribbage. And I sat with him in a bistro with a carafe of wine, and we played cribbage by the hour. And under those circumstances, when he didn't have to show off to anybody, he was a very nice man. And eventually, when time came to leave, he asked if I'd like to go and work for the corporation. Well, everybody else had been after him for a job, but I hadn't, because we become friends. And so I said, sure, I might, Nick, might. So he said, well, I'll mention it to the old man. This is Mr. Conrad Hilton he's talking about. So I said, fine, that's fine. I never expect to hear another word. Within a month, I had a letter from Conrad Hilton. Nick tells me you want to come, arrange everything through so-and-so, go to New York and work at the Plaza in New York. Well, the fellow in New York was transferred to open the first Hilton International Hotel in Puerto Rico, and he said, you want to come there? And I said, yes, so I went off down there. And they employed me as a bellboy. I'd been a captain in the Gurkhas, and I'd graduate from the hotel school in Switzerland, and they offered me this job as a bellboy. I said, sure, I'll take it. So I took it, and that's the way I started. And when the hotel opened, Nick came down with his father and all the big shots for the opening ceremonies. It was the first Hilton International Hotel there ever was. I called him on the house phone and said, Nick, I just want to thank you very much for getting me this job. I'm having a great time. I'm enjoying myself. And thanks a lot. I hope you'll have a good stay. He said, you got to come up for a drink. I said, Nick, it's different now. I'm a small-time employee here. Your father's the boss of the whole thing. I can't come like that. He said, you got to come up. So I went up the fire escape, and I climbed in the window and had a couple of drinks with him. And during the course of conversation, I asked Nick how long he was staying. He said, well, I might just stay for the ceremonies that there are 2 or 3 days. But you see, there's a girl. And well, I'd heard this from Nick a few times. But this girl is special. And if she'll come down and spend a little time, well, I'll maybe stay on a week or so. He said, she's a wonderful girl. You might even have heard of her. She's a big starlet. I said, Nick, who's this? He said, her name's Elizabeth Taylor. And I had been living in Switzerland, and I hadn't seen any of these kind of films. And I had to say, sorry, Nick, never heard of her. And of course, he was her first husband eventually. Anyway, I stayed with Hilton for a couple of years. They sent me to Cornell University to do summer school. Enjoyed every minute of that. And then they sent me to New York as sales promotion manager for Hilton International. And time came, they wanted to send me to Chicago. Didn't fancy that. And I was about 26, 27 maybe. And I said, well, to myself, well, either I'm going to quit now, or I'm going to stay on with this big corporation for the rest of my days. So I decided to quit. Eventually I found I had some friends that had been in hotel school with me, a married couple, English people, who had gone to Jamaica because their family had some business interests there. And I was corresponding with them. They said, come to Jamaica, lots of opportunity, get your good job. So I got on a ship to go to Jamaica. It happened to stop in Barbados for 6 to 8 hours. I'd met a couple of Barbadian people on the ship. And I looked around, and in the 6 to 8 hours I was there, I looked around, and I liked the look of the place. It smelled good to me. So when the ship got to the next port, which was Trinidad, I got off the ship and flew back to Barbados. to have another look around before flying all the way up to Jamaica. And I never left. And it was the happiest thing that ever happened to me in my life. And I've been there now for 53 years, and that's where I belong. That's my home. I'm a Barbadian West Indian as far as I'm concerned now. And I was very fortunate. I had a small inheritance, if I remember rightly, about £12,000, which is a lot of money in those days. And I bought a small hotel, small place. And that's where I worked for the next 15 years, oh, it was more than that, 18, 19 years, before the place burned down in 1969. And I have to say that it was a very successful small hotel, greatly due to the help I got from my wife Joan, who worked with me in there, and somehow managed to find time to give me 3 fine children. Well, they weren't so fine when they were babies, but they haven't grown up too bad, you know? And that was also a few years after, when I got into politics, which is a whole different story. But in 1956, there was a new party which had just started in Barbados. And it was bright young fellas. They'd just come back as lawyers and all kinds of qualifications and different things. And they, there was a white fella. There was an awful colour bar, I should mention, in Barbados when I went there. It was dreadful. It was as bad as South Africa if it wasn't legally so. And that didn't suit me. I'd been living amongst and friends with and playing with and being with in the service with Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, Parsis, a whole lot. And I didn't like this colour bar thing. So I tried to mold my business on the basis of that. Any black person that came along, as far as I was concerned, they were welcome, come in. And we got a big business going at the old St. Lawrence. But I had a friend, well, no. I had to get a lawyer, of course, to deal with the purchase of the hotel. I was the most junior, unimportant client of a big firm of lawyers. So consequently, I was introduced to the newest qualified lawyer that they had to look after my affairs. Well, he happened to be a white Barbadian, a big family, big important plantation family. And he had also been in the Indian Army, curiously. And he had come back, as so many people did, from the war, imbued with the idea that the old systems and the old customs and the old things were no good. We had to change the world. That was the attitude of the youngsters, which is how, of course, Churchill got kicked out when he'd done so much for Britain. But the young people came in and said, we want something new. Well, Douglas wanted something new. And he was a white Barbadian. And there was an interesting issue with him. He wanted to become a founder member of this new party which had progressive ideas. And some of them said, they were all the others were black. And some of them said, well, you know, he's a nice fella, but it wouldn't give the right impression for our party if he were to join our party. He's a white man of a big family, the wealthy people, and we're for the poor, you know, and all this sort of stuff. So, big row went on. Well, Douglas was not allowed to be a founder member of the party, but he was made the first member to be accepted next day. So he was my friend. I canvassed for him in the 1956 election, and he was my friend, but he dropped out of politics when he lost, and I stayed on. So that's how I got involved in politics. But Errol Barrow, who was my leader and my friend, and who was an ex-Royal Air Force navigating officer, he was the leader of the party at that time. And he came to me and he said, "Peter, I'm very glad to know that you've joined the party. We need fellas like you if we're going to ever make anything in this country." But he said, "Let me give you one word of advice. Don't tell anybody." Because he knew that I had a small hotel catering mainly to white people, and if they thought I was consorting with this bunch of people who at that time were called communists, because anybody you didn't like, you called them a communist. If anybody thought I was consorting with them, they wouldn't come and patronize me. So he said, "Keep quiet, don't tell anybody." So I was a closet Dem until 1961 when we won the government. And I was very active in tourism all this time. I found a member of the Hotel Association. I was president 3 times. And when they started a tourist board, which was the first time in 1958, I was one of the persons appointed. And I became chairman of that in 1963. And I was chairman until 1970, when I resigned because I was running for Parliament. And it was a very interesting time. I had a wonderful time at that time. So we developed tourism. We started really developing tourism at that time. It was a time when the jet airplanes first came in early 1960s, and that made all the difference to us because we were fairly far away. I had another unpaid job in 1965 when Barbados and Guyana decided to go to Expo 67, the World's Fair in Montreal. And I was asked by my friend, the Prime Minister, Errol Barrow, who really did me a wonderful thing. He showed such confidence in me and asked me, and many people said, "Well, you know, he's a white Englishman. Why can't a black Barbadian be appointed?" And Errol said, "No, he's the right man." So that was that. In 1966, I ran for the first time for Parliament at rather short notice. And I was short only of 200 votes. So I didn't do too badly. So Errol appointed me to the Senate. And so I served as a senator. And we have a very good system of the Senate, which is the upper house, like the House of Lords or the Senate in Canada, where the Senate only lasts for the length of the House, duration of the House. So when the House is dissolved, the Senate's gone. So I was a senator for 5 years at that time. And during that time, I chose my constituency and I started to work it. And this was a constituency which was 95% black. But I had no problem with that, whatever. Never at any time during all these years of canvassing, from 1956 up to the last election last year, never did I have anybody rude to me because I was a white man. I enjoyed it so much, this electioneering, this canvassing and things. In 1971, I won a seat. And I was appointed Minister of Tourism, Information, Public Relations. And that was a great experience. I thoroughly enjoyed this. In 1976, our party lost the government, and I lost my seat by 9 votes. And I decided not to run again. I honestly felt I'd done enough for the people. If they didn't want me, that was all right with me. So I didn't run again. And I went back to sort of private business. I would have to interject here a credit that I have to give to my wife, Margaret. because any wife whose husband is in politics would tell you what a tough thing it is. You're out all kinds of hours. You're mixing around in rum shops. Weekends are spent canvassing. You hardly see your wife, let alone your children. And my wife looked after the kids and put up with all this and even encouraged me to some extent. Not greatly, but to some extent. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the politics. I had some great fun out of it. I have many stories to tell. I would just tell one, which I'll try and make brief. The Queen came in 1974, and there was to be a big show in the car park of the Prime Minister's residence. A big stage was set up, and chairs were put down, and tents were put up, and 2,000 people were to be there with the Queen, and people would sing and dance, you know, and it was great. It was all very good. So we were given, as ministers, a number of invitation cards to send to our friends and supporters, see. And so I had made a list, and I gave it to my secretary. She filled in the names, posted them off. Well, I had a good friend, a very good supporter, who's still a friend today, whose name was Ted Roy Daniel. And the invitation went to Mr. and Mrs. Ted Roy Daniel. Now, Ted Roy, that we ordinarily call Chicken, he's known by Chicken. Everybody in Barbados is known by a nickname. You don't find out their real names until you read the obituary. So Chicken now, he had his nice wife, 3 little children, nice house, everything so perfectly good. Only thing was, they never marched up the aisle. They'd never been married. And that is quite a normal state of affairs in Barbados. It always was, and a very expensive business getting married. So this invitation arrives, and Joyce, his wife, reads this thing and gets into a fury. It is addressed to Mr. and Mrs. She ain't no Mrs. What the hell is the skipper doing sending an invitation to Mrs.? He knows blasted well, the skipper, of course, being the Prime Minister, who she knows, who she imagines has written this card himself. See? Mr. and Mrs. No, who the hell would ever marry Chicken? Not me. I ain't married Chicken. Good God. Well, I think I'm going to any function, blasted thing. Never mind the Queen, not me. Not me, leave me out, you know. Well, this was a terrible row. Chicken wants to go. He wants very much to be able to say to his pals in the rum shop, as I was saying to the Queen, you know, and the Queen said to me, and all this kind of stuff, you see. So it was a terrible thing. It was a awful thing for this family. But they solved it. They resolved the matter. They went out and got married. They went out and got married before the function, and they went Mr. and Mrs. to the function. Well, that's the kind of fun you had in politics. I really had a lot of fun in politics. And I am still involved. I still help the younger fellas where I can. And I enjoy still canvassing. I really do. I've made so many friends amongst people I wouldn't ordinarily have met. And I'm made welcome amongst these folk. I remember so well one day, I come to a house, knock on the door, when I was going around with the other fella, knock on the door, a lady, big fat lady, elderly lady, peers out and she looks around very suspiciously. And then she sees me, Mr. Morgan, that is you? Hi, I ain't seen you in donkey years. Come and give the old girl a hug. And that was the wonderful thing that I remember from politics. Friendliness, courtesy, you know? So anyway, we lost the government in there, and then at that time I was president of the Caribbean Tourism Association. I've been president of just about every Caribbean thing in tourism. And we were looking for a new executive director. I was told to look for him. And we lost the government. I was no longer president. I applied for the job and was appointed. So off we went to New York for two years and had a wonderful time in New York. Loved it. Very lucky in every respect, made many friends. Saw all the shows and everything. And I traveled a good deal because I've traveled all through the Caribbean in one capacity or another. I know every island. And so that was 2 years. Then we came back again. And I started to write a book. And then our party won back the government in 1986. And the Prime Minister, Mr. Barrow again, asked me if I'd like to be High Commissioner of Canada. So I said, I have to be truthful about this. I said, I have to ask Margaret, my wife. And I said, Margaret, Errol wants to know if we would go to Ottawa. She said, not for hell. Not for hell. Ottawa is a nasty little place. They roll up the sideworks at 6 in the evening. Nothing ever happens in Ottawa. It's cold, it's damp, it's nasty. Anyway, she decided that she would come with me. And of course, when we got to Ottawa, we found that where we both remembered Ottawa from 20 years before, it now was a vibrant place with good theatre, all kinds of things happening. And we had 4 very happy years there in amongst that. One of the highlights of which was a trip to the Arctic, which the Canadian government organized. We spent 7 days right up into the high Arctic, and on the top of the Bering Sea at a place called Inuvik, I meet a black Barbadian who's been in the Arctic for 21 years. I would have to say the other highlight of my time in Ottawa, though I traveled Canada and there were many memorable things, one of the most memorable things of my whole life was one time when Errol Barrow's sister, who he doesn't like to have it said that she's his sister because it smells of nepotism. She was now our ambassador at the United Nations. She had been a member of the Eminent Persons Group, which the Commonwealth sent to South Africa, a party of 7, to try and help resolve the apartheid thing before it broke down. And she was the only woman. And she was the only woman also to visit Nelson Mandela in prison outside of his own immediate family during the whole time he was in prison. So they were friends. So when she heard Nelson Mandela was coming to Ottawa, she wanted to come and meet him. And in fact, her ambition was that he should come and spend a vacation in Barbados. Well, she came up to stay with us, and she spoke to Mrs. Mandela, and Mrs. Mandela said, well, look, they got us very busy, they got a tight schedule, but the moment I can see an opportunity, I'll give you a call. Hold tight and wait for me. So it happened that the call came on a Sunday afternoon, and our driver from the mission was off duty on Sunday. So I said, Nita, I'm going to drive, I'll drive you. So I drove Dame Nita Barrow to the hotel where the Mandelas were staying, dropped her at the door, and went off to park the car, and quite resolved to come and sit in the lobby till she'd been to see Mr. Mandela and come back down. And I see her sitting there. She's waiting for me. I said, Nita, you haven't gone up yet? You're coming with me. You've got to come with me. So she took me up there, and we spent a half hour with Mr. Mandela and Mr. Thabo Mbeki. And it was one of those times, one of those few times in my life that I remembered what I'd been told as a kid, and I spoke only when I was spoken to. Well, there were so many happy things happened up there. But anyway, after 4 years we came home, and I'm now engaged in a totally new project, which is representing Canadian companies under a tax treaty we have with Canada in franchising and licensing internationally and marketing. And it's a business that really keeps me interested. It's totally different, everything I do. And each one is totally separate. One took me to China just recently, and I love that. So I've had a very happy time. I'm a very fortunate man. And, I can't ask for more than, to have it run over again.